So next, specific set of requirements. Ito naman po ay para sa ating mga OFW or Overseas Filipino Workers. So what do our OFWs need to be able to be approved for a Pag-ibig Home Loan? First, we need a latest contract of employment. So must be translated in English. Pages must be complete and readable. Must have the details of the buyer and the position. So buyer is the client mismo na nagre-reserve. Must have the buyer's compensation and currency na nakalagay sa contract niya. Must have the date of commencement and a duration of employment. Must have the name and signature of the issuer unless stated that the signature is no longer required. And a signature stamp is present. So there are some people or some companies who would rather use a signature stamp. Number 2, kailangan natin ng isang certificate of employment or salary certificate. So this must be provided if the buyer's contract has expired and no new contract has been issued after the renewal, and if the buyer is a household or personal employee. So those are the 3 reasons kung bakit kakailanganin natin ng isang certificate of employment or salary certificate. So again, kung expired ang kontrata or there is no new contract issued after the renewal of the contract, or if the buyer is a household or personal employee. So for a company-employed person, okay, must have a company letterhead, must have the salary and position of the buyer, must have the date of commencement, and must have the name and signature of issuer unless stated that signature is no longer required or a signature stamp is present. For a household or personal employee, so ito yung third. So the first description was for the first 2 situations, yung expired na yung contract or walang bagong contract after renewal. So ito yung third situation dito. Yung for household or personal employees, can be handwritten by the employer, must have the salary and position of the buyer or the person who's reserving, must have the date of commencement of the position, must have employer's contract details, contact number or email address, must have the name and signature of the employer, same with the presented ID. So kung ang ating client ay syempre hihingin pa niya to sa kanyang amo, it would be best kung tulungan na lang nila yung amo nila na makapag-formulate ng isang salary certificate based on the required information by Pag-ibig. Number 3, latest payslip and allotment slip. So number 1, payslip for supporting documents only if the contract or certificate of employment is handwritten. Must be latest. It must have the name of the buyer. Must be translated in English. Secondly, allotment slip with bank statement if the buyer is a seaman. Number 3, proof of remittance form. Obviously, at the time of takeout, kailangan din ito ay latest. It must have the name of the sender and receiver, regardless if the sender is the buyer or if the sender is not the buyer. Kumbaga, pinapautos na lang niya or pinapahinga na lang niya ng tulong ng ibang tao para magpadala ng kanyang sweldo sa kanyang pamilya. Must have the country origin of sender and receiver. Number 4, kailangan ng ID of employer. Kung ang employee, ang ating buyer ay private. So sa mga household help, sa mga drivers, etc. Basta nagtatrabaho sa isang private employee, kailangan po ng ID of employer to complement the salary certificate na na-discuss natin kanina. So number 1, must have the signature or signature stamp of the employer. Details must match on the signed salary certificate or certificate of employment. Number 5, copy of passport. Must not be expired, must have the signature of the buyer, and must match on other documents presented. Number 6, special power of attorney. This must be provided if the buyer and or spouse is an OFW. So there's 2 types. Meron tayong locally notarized and consularized. So locally notarized, yan yung mga nandito sa Pilipinas na pwedeng magpa-notarize ng kanilang SPA. Pagka ang ating client ay nag-provide ng locally notarized SPA, obviously kailangan din nila mag-provide ng proof na nandito sila sa Pilipinas. So this is mostly in the form of a arrival and departure stamp. Dahil kung hindi sila makakapag-provide ng arrival and departure stamp, there is no proof na nandito siya para mag-notarize ng kanyang SPA. Ang notarized SPA must have the correct details of the buyer and must match with the presented birth certificate and marriage contract. A photocopy or scanned copy is not accepted. It should be 4 original copies. Date of notary must be tallied with Philippine arrival and departure stamps. And it must have a doc, page, book, and series number as with anything notarized. Na kung ang client natin ay wala sa Pilipinas at the time na na-execute niya yung SPA, they can provide a consularized SPA. Just recently, as of March 2022, pinapayagan na rin ang apostille SPA, which is much cheaper than a consularized SPA. So one original copy is required, must have the correct details of the buyer, and must match with the presented birth certificate and marriage contract. Second page of special power of attorney must have the signature of the principal borrower, spouse, attorney-in-fact, and witnesses. Number 7, obviously, kung meron tayong SPA or Special Power of Attorney, kailangan din ng ID of the attorney-in-fact. So, I discussed earlier sa general requirements kung ano yung mga examples ng mga valid government IDs na kailangan ng isang attorney-in-fact. Now, just make sure, tandaan lang natin yung 3 key aspects of a valid government ID, which is number 1, must have a picture and signature, must not be expired, and must have 3 specimen signatures. So just like with spouse ID, co-borrower ID, and principal borrower ID, lahat sila ay pare-pareho ng requirement when it comes to a government ID.